Drop the fan.
Okay, please come inside. Gather.
Probably just no.
Now, everything's going to be happening up here so I can video it. So we have the camera there. But please stand where you can see and hear. I'd like to say thanks to Kris for allowing us to have this launch here. It was right down to the 11th hour to arrange it. I have to say an incredible thank you to Professor McGorry. He is one of our ultimate heroes. You may not know he's Australian in the year 2010. He set up Headspace. He's the head of Orygen. He knows more about youth mental health than I think anybody else on the planet. The gentleman in question about whom this book is written is our former late son, Francois. Anne has been working on this book for 10 years, and it's been a labour of love and a labour of great pain. I'm going to ask Anne to say a few words and then introduce Professor McGorry, but we would just like to say thank you so much, sir. We are so honoured to have you here.
Thank you. And before Giles retreats behind the lens, I'd also like to thank him for all his support, but also for his beautiful cover. Giles has taken up photography again. He's always done photography for most of his life, but he's really sailing along now, and he gave me this choice of about 40 images.
400.
And my publisher, owe him a thanks as well. He's away in Slovakia, so I've had to do a lot of the promotion for the launch myself, and I felt like a rabid self-promoter. So thank you all for coming. I don't know very many of you, so I'm very pleased to see you all. And some other people I'd like to thank for being here are two ladies from the organisation called Compassionate Friends, Sue and Jenny, who provide support to bereaved parents. And when we first lost Francois, their newsletter was a lifeline for me. They are all over the world, but the Victorian branch is particularly active, and it seems to me that Victorian branches of anything are wonderful. My friend Annie Warringah from the Youth Research Centre in Melbourne is lurking somewhere. There she is. I used to work in a youth research organisation, and I had this room full of, not poetry, but youth research books. But when our son was struggling, I couldn't connect all that literature to what we were going through in our own home. I'm trying now to write a thesis about that, and ultimately another book. This book is more about my journey rather than our son's. Our son had quite a few complex problems, mostly deep depression. And by introduction, I should, yes, perhaps I'll read this part first.
But then you've got to introduce
at the end.
You're reading after.
Yes, okay, yes. So I'll start off with a poem about him later on. Who else have it done? There's a reference to what I call the soft leak drug. When our son died, our surviving son spoke at the funeral, and his opening words were, "There are no such things as soft drugs." And those words have always stayed in my mind, and it morphed into the phrase, the soft leak drug, in here. Well, over to Professor McGorry, who I knew of when I worked in youth research, and when he invented Headspace, I just thought what an incredible concept this was. It grew out of his work with Orygen Youth Health, which was the world's best centre for youth mental health research. 2 days before our son died, Headspace was made a national initiative with Headspace centres being announced throughout Australia. But during our son's lifetime, there was only Headspace in Melbourne. And then it occurred to me and Giles when it came to be that I could launch this book here, because we live in Tasmania, to ask Professor McGorry if he would consider launching it. And he said yes, and I was just so delighted, and I couldn't think of anybody I'd rather have that honour. So, Professor McGorry, over to you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and first of all, I'd just like to thank Anne and Giles for the big honour of asking me to do this. And she emailed me, and I emailed straight back and said I was really, really happy to do this. And maybe I'll explain why, because I suppose probably go back about 15 years ago, and it had more to do with suicide than accidental overdoses, as with Francois. But I met with groups of parents, and so the people from Compassionate Friends, it's great that you're here too, because I was incredibly struck by how isolated parents who lost someone from suicide actually were, and it's just very similar with an overdose as well. And so that's been something that's been really big for me, and I suppose the whole suicide or premature death issue for young people, all these wasted lives that could have been saved, and that's what I was very, very sort of motivated by. That it's not like when someone has a terminal illness. These are problems which, if you can, with some luck and effort, they're all potentially saved. They can all be potentially saved, but of course we can't control everything. Even if it's just the 1% thing that we can't control, even if things are looking good, like with Francois, things can go wrong very quickly. And so I've always, and I wasn't sure if I could do this without being emotional, because one of my own sons was in this space as well, and I've got 3 sons, and one of them struggled a lot with medical problems too, and he's actually improving a lot now, but he nearly died some years ago as well, and could easily have. And apart from all the people who died, there are so many that are in that cliff zone, if I can put it that way, and our job as a society is to try to create a much better environment and system of care, so that they can actually have the best chance of making it through, which is an incredibly difficult period of life for all of us, probably. If we think back, and at least for 50% of people will really go under at some point or another along that journey, and that's why we have tried to develop things like headspace, which is a good thing. It needs to be a lot more, and governments are always very kind of, what's the word, unreliable in terms of their commitment to these things. So got a big job in front of us still, but that's a bit of background to why it's such a pleasure to meet Anne and Giles, and more than anything else to read her wonderful work. And I've got to say, I'm not the most scholarly person on the planet, and I feel a bit intimidated in these sorts of settings. But I am an Irishman, so there is poetry in our soul, and there are the poems that I kind of relate to are probably Irish poetry, Yeats and so on, and they're the ones that have stuck with me. But when I read Anne's poetry, I thought it was amazing, and the reviews probably do a lot more justice to it than I ever could. But I think one of the reviewers said the poems never flinch, and that makes them even more fragile. That's a very good way of putting it. So I also brought this along because I just happened to be reading this, the Lancet Psychiatry. It's sort of one of the major journals in mental health. The Lancet, obviously, you've probably heard of that, international medical journal. And they happen to have an article about poetry. And poetry and music and art in general are incredibly relevant to mental health, as I'm sure everyone in this room would know. So it's not surprising there's an article on poetry in the psychiatric journal. And it's reviewing a book called Life-Saving Poems which seemed incredibly relevant to what Anne had written. And they asked the question, how many poems resound with a person across the course of their lifetime? And I guess, you know, people can think of such poems. And he says there's something redemptive and healing in the art of making, speaking, listening to and reading poems. And I think that's what Anne has been able to, that's the way I sort of read her poetry in that way. So this book, anyway, it's another book which might be worth reading as well. Regardless of your own unique journey and life lessons, life-saving poems offers an avenue to mend the intrinsic brokenness of the human experience, and I think that's really what Anne's done here. And so he also, and the reviewer goes on to say, such poetry is like falling in love over and over again, and it can save your life too, one stanza at a time. And I think, you know, you can see that in that, what Anne's written as well, but at least I did anyway. So, you know, I suppose it's really important that these experiences are communicated in a way to the world, and Anne's obviously an incredibly accomplished poet, and poetry is one of the ways to do that. If you're not a poet, or if you're not a literary scholar, sometimes it's a bit hard to feel or see the meanings in poetry. You have to really think, and it takes time maybe to really see what's being said, and you probably need to take time to do that. But I think it doesn't take much time to sort of see and feel what is happening in this poetry, and it's something very special. And I didn't know that when I said yes to be here tonight, but I read the book and sent me the book, and it was a pleasure to read. Well, I can't say it's a pleasure because it's painful as well. I can't say it's a pleasure actually, but you know, it was very moving, and it's very moving to be here tonight, and just want to say that I sort of just want to be here with them tonight. Thank you.
So could I ask you to say a little more about youth mental health subsequently, or either after the reading, or
sure.
but we value any opinion you wish to deliver. I wish to get you started.
Okay.
The book's divided into 6 sections, and the first section is, I suppose, my bumbling life, trundling through over the past preceding 10 years before this tragic event. But there are intimations along the way that things are not quite as they should be. I thought, for the sake of thematic unity tonight, I'd keep what I read to one kind of poem. When our son died, it was very sudden. Giles was in Zurich with him, and I was in Hobart, and I found myself having suddenly to fly overseas. The journey to my son. I fly to you, oh so slowly, and I search each cloud for your face. I think I see you with your hair combed, neat, dressed in white, looking slightly awake, slightly different in sleep, dressed in white as delicate as cloud, and your hands folded as I knew they would be, your long slim fingers quiet all the strings, and I dressed all the clouds in your white, and I dressed all the clouds with your face, and I carried you with me as I flew to you. But you were already there, in that faraway place where the waves and the sea and plains and the clouds carry people too when they go so far away. More clouds, more waves, how is this so? What can I make of this journey? Will you know I saw you out at sea, on the waves of the world, as you dream in the cloud of unbeing? How will you make that journey home? How foreign are we now, all apart, me in the sky, you in the heavens, your brother on one continent, your father another, and your lover journeying home to grieve you. We are fractions of ourselves, factored out into cloud, not seeing, not feeling, being, cloud light. One of my school friends, whom I haven't seen since 1968, is here tonight. And another school friend was in Zurich, where Francois and Giles were holidaying. And Giles hadn't seen him since that time too. And he kept saying, you are in Zurich, you must come to see the Alps. And I said, well, I'm not a tourist. But he insisted. He said, you've got to see the Alps. And on the way, there's a long poem here about this journey up into the clouds. But on the way, he stopped at a very ancient monastery that's become a cathedral called Einsiedeln, where there's a statue of the Black Madonna. I'm new to grief. The moon travels with me everywhere in Zurich, riding. Libby writes from Africa. She tells me before you'd left, she'd covered you with a shawl as you slept. She says she weeps for you, for all our gentle sons. In your travel bag, a gift from Marlene, 2 silk scarves, one black as if she knew, and one ethereal blue. At night, full moon, phone calls, Paris, Hobart, the pond at midnight, the pond at dawn, and then a journey to the monastery, Einsiedeln, Romanesque and Gothic and Baroque, in a cobbled square, flooded with the morning sun. Inside it's crowded, filled with chants, cymbals, song, gentle Latin hymns, all for you, my lost son, for everyone, rise through the incense-laden air to the angels in their vaulted sky of gold rococo. As tourists press to see the Black Madonna, I stand and listen, kneel and pray, light a candle, set it down, this dancing, winged, breathing thing. I cannot let it go. Your young life. I'm so used to protecting you, covering you. The red candle blazes in my hand for all our gentle sons. The moon travels with me, day and night, riding. Hard to write in this new place, feeling my way through words, through worlds. To my left, a choir of chefs sing as they serve meals to the merry. Ahead, a studio of artists, brushes, canvases, and a table laid ready for a meal of cyclamen and lily and a jar of water. Something sudden, like dark, like owl, like bird, that you don't feel, but hear, sits in the bottom of my womb. A new swollen tide of waves moves towards and comes nearer and nearer and tells me things I don't want to hear. You are in the waves that I watch from this window, grey, heaven-leaden waves, troubled on the surface, inexorable in their depth, wave after wave coming toward me. But you never come, though I wait. Each wave reminds me, I am on the shore, you are seafaring. I am bound to rock and sand, you are sky and water. Moon again, huge yellow moon. Look down on this place and weep with me a while, and let me sleep in your arms, O false moon of mine. So black in the sky, so silent your shelter in the clouds, so vast your knowledge of lovers and secret. Both the owl and the dove reveal to you their nest. Your light, so like rain, falls all over me, and your journey always too far. How many times will you leave me? Gradually one becomes accustomed to grief and you're accommodated. This one's set at Cornelian Bay, which is an ancient bay in Hobart called Cornelian after the carnelian stone, which the early settlers picked out of the beach so that there are no carnelian stones left. But anyway, that's where the cemetery is. Marigold, Marigold. Mr. Burns's grave is handy as a seat. The gravestones are my friends. We all face east. We greet the day, the moon, the snows. We don't bow to the wind like cards. Birds understand. Plovers perch on crosses. Dive bomb the mother bending over the tap, making the sad girl crying laugh. 10 years and Mrs. Luke behind us still puts marigolds into Christ's silver hands. Marigolds for Mary on her son's grave. For Mary, Mother of God, understands her sorrows. Marigold, marigold, the colour of my younger son's hair. The French flag flies nearby at a monument for the fallen, and further on, the Presentation Sisters lie in their own pebbled square, and marigold, marigold, the colour of his hair. Mr. Nichols is there each day, sits talking to his wife, kisses her headstone goodbye like a hospital visitor, but maybe more loving. He tells me that he's never missed a day. Let the dead bury their dead. Near the tap in the children's section at the tree with the wind chimes, a nameless grave has grown a gnarled rose white. I water it each visit. In summer it flowers, stretches out toward the path, rose red. At the huge old cypress, someone's left a bowl of water for the birds, rosellas, galahs, sulphur-crested cockatoos. The crows prefer to sip the water from the broken vases further down the hill at the stone that says Our Dad's Garden. Our headstone quotes Euripides, the text engraved, though not in gold. And a path is there where no man sought, so hath it fallen here. Marigold, marigold. If we see a butterfly, it's for Anne Morgan's daughter. If a dragonfly, it's ours, for Frenchie. More often it's an ant, skittish on hot stone. Never ducks, until today, when a pair made their way slowly toward us through the long grass, all the way from Cornelian Bay, or the rivulet perhaps. The Jewish cemetery is grey, just script on stone. A pebble maybe from the Holy Land. The bones of Ike Solomon, Dickens's Fagin, lie here. No green, no grass, no trees, no flowers to muddle the issues of life and death. Martin Cash, bushranger, is singled out only by a signpost, a white weather vane in green grass. In the distance, highway traffic, pines, the river, all weathers, skies, heavens, occasionally a learner driver, seldom lovers, sometimes children, always clouds to smother us with peace. And once I dreamt our son stood with me there, arm about me, facing out, looking towards the mountain. So hath it fallen here. And marigold, marigold, the colour of our hair. And this last one, in a very telegraphic, condensed form, gives you a slight picture of our son, sometimes seen in the background of a novel by Coetzee, a pale, hurrying young man he strikes a chord. History lesson. The Umberto Eco phase. The drum kit solo. Winterizer. Phases of the moon. It's just the contents of the psyche, says the man in the white room. Images sink away and water spills over the dam wall, flooding thought with mantra, symbols, syllables, and patterns built of 4s, the square roots of 2, just the contents of the psyche. Something insists in silence. Thank you.
Encore. Give us a message.
So,
It's interesting that he's under Bukowski. I'm sure he'd appreciate Bukowski.
thank you. Maybe you would like me to say a little bit more about youth mental health?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, why is youth mental health such a major issue? Well, just a few facts. 75% of all mental disorders, mental ill health, including substance use problems, will appear before the age of 25. So, and 50%, as I said before, 50% of young people will experience a period of poor mental health in the transition to adulthood. And some people say, well, it's just teenage angst is normal in that case. If it's that common, what do you mean? How can it be a health problem? But that overlooks the fact that probably 100% of kids would have some sort of physical health problem during that period. And no one says, sorry, you're not allowed to go to the doctor, you're not allowed to get any health care. So it's got to do with prejudice and stigma and labelling and all this sort of other stuff. But the bottom line is that the vast majority of these young people get very little help. And their parents similarly, in terms of that's being the situation. Now, we've tried to sort of make the case with, I suppose, with some success, to especially the federal government, that something needs to be done about this. And the problem that the governments often have is they know there's a big problem, but they don't know what to do about it. So there's let's say child protection, that's another big one. And domestic violence would be another one. So everyone says, yes, we know it's serious, but what do we do? The sort of wicked problem idea. So part of the thing that we have to do is say, it's not actually that hard. Basically, you have to provide a space where young people can be heard, can be listened to and understood, and it's safe, that they can trust, and that isn't stigmatised. So that's sort of what's behind the thinking of headspace. And obviously young people and families had to have some input into that so that it was right. So it wasn't just traditional professional groups that would say how it should be. Because mostly when that's done, it's done for the convenience of the professional groups rather than for how it should be for the public or the people who need help. And the other thing is the idea of early intervention, intervening early, not waiting till problems get really, really serious before you actually get any help. And that lesson's been learned in other health and social areas, like most obviously in cancer and heart disease and those sort of areas, where people say, well, of course, you wouldn't wait till someone has a heart attack or develops heart failure before you sort of start offering some help. You don't put the bar so high that... but that was something that's been very difficult to get over the line in mental health, to say that that's the same thing, And I first started working in the area of schizophrenia and psychosis, back 30 years ago, and in those days, and still too much today as well. The first treatment people got was when they were acutely psychotic, very distressed, disturbed, often aggressive or suicidal, and they were offered treatment in an emergency situation, often with the police or some terrible, sort of trauma associated with it. And yet they had been unwell for, maybe months or even years, before that actually came to that. And it was pretty obvious that they needed help much earlier than that. So big thing was to try to get in earlier, and also the other thing was to treat them in a therapeutic way, not in a harmful way, because in those days probably the treatment was doing more harm than good, because they'd be giving large amounts of medication and nothing much else. So that was where we started with that, and having shown that with research and developing new treatments and moderating the use of medication, which was nearly always needed in those patients. It's on a very low level, but it was needed. But getting the right mix of treatments and showing that if you did that, and you didn't tell these young people that they weren't going to get better and their lives were sort of doomed, that's what psychiatrists used to say to these young people, that actually transformed the outcomes. So the outcomes were much better, believe it or not. And intervening earlier did work in mental health just like it does in other potentially serious illnesses. And interestingly, a lot of the resistance to these reforms didn't come from the public or from politicians actually, or bureaucrats. It came from people working in the health professions who tried to question this evidence and question the idea. It's interesting, that we're our own worst enemies in mental health in some ways, But I suppose what we learned from that and got a lot of confidence was that if we could do that for the more serious forms of illness, we could do it for the whole spectrum of mental health problems, whether it was, personality difficulties or depression or anxiety or eating disorders and so on, drug and alcohol. All of these things are what young people sort of grapple with. So as you move through puberty and into adult life, some of these young people have had problems in childhood, but the level and severity and prevalence of the problems gets a lot worse from puberty onwards, and it peaks in the early 20s, So that's their main health problem. It's not just that 50% of them will have some sort of issue, but they're pretty physically healthy these days, There's no such thing as tuberculosis these days for young adults like there was, My dad was a TB physician who worked in tuberculosis. He had to watch young people die in the 1930s and 40s from tuberculosis. Now that's not the problem now. What they're dying from these days is what we've been hearing about tonight, drug and alcohol problems, suicide, and in a way that's so much better situation to be in, because there's nothing structural or irreversible that we can't actually deal with as long as we actually take it seriously. And the trouble is, we haven't taken it seriously. We're still not taking it seriously. Like the federal government spent the last couple of years conducting a National Mental Health Commission, looking at how mental health funding is spent federally, and that's fine. I mean, their plan is okay, but there's no more money. There's no sense of we need to invest more in this area at the moment. The sense is, how can we find efficiencies? Well, when 13% of young men are getting access to care when they need it, and 31% of young women, and even across the whole lifespan, only 16% of people with depression get evidence-based care. I mean, imagine if that was happening with breast cancer, what would be happening? But, in the case of mental health, the government feels comfortable to say, well, it's just a matter of efficiency, and there's no more money. There's more money for everything else. There's more money for submarines. Weapons, and detention centres and whatever is politically necessary, then that's okay. But when it's about people's lives, young people's lives, that's much lower down the pecking order. And why is that? Well, I suppose the only way politicians can say that, and many of the politicians want to help, just to give them, their credit. I think they would help if they felt the public were expecting it or demanding it. But the public has been quite silent in a way, or relatively silent. They're quite happy to have Beyond Blue out there saying awareness is up. They're quite happy to have the ABC, and thank you to the ABC, by the way, for Mental As, that was great. But they're happy just to have the conversation and have awareness improving and being able to talk about it, but there's no translation of that into action, or not enough. So that's what when I said don't get me started, that was what I was that's what I meant. Because I know that the vast majority of these lives can be saved.